An outsider? Here?" muttered Edith, in astonishment. Her cheeks blossomed and lips tautened. The simple event of some stranger in the village was both worthy of suspicion and a good chinwag. The advantage of being the landlady of the only tavern within a safe and comfortable walk reliably saw that such juicy rumours came directly to Edith, which suited her just fine. She could remain in her cosy tavern safe and sound, which was just fine by her too. The village of Ensum was contentedly isolated. It saw enough bounty from the sea and modest farmland on its borders to sustain it. It had a naturally sheltered harbour in Sandbag Bay. The land there sloped mildly to the water's edge, and the incessant storms blustering in from the Innocuous Sea were snuffed of their merciless vigour by the bay's crescent shape. "Well, who'd ever heard of the likes of it?" said Edith, with an indignant huff, as she streaked the dark wood counter with a damp cloth that smelt of an unhealthy coction of ale and stagnant gutter water. She leant herself up against the bar on a broad beer-keg-toting forearm to pay attention with both ears. Not once had Edith, in all her long years, garnered the compulsion to set foot beyond Ensum's borders. Why, she would be snapped up by foul-smelling middites, skulking down from the wind-whipped mountains, sniffing about for fresh meat, or worse, bewitched by wicked spirits and driven quite mad, should she even take in but the faintest breath of the fetid air lingering along the boundaries of the cursed Drakeswood. At least, that was what old Ensum folks stoutly declared. "They says this here outlander come into the village atop one of them there mechanical thingamies," said Wilb, a mainstay of the hog's trotter. Spluttering gossip through ale-moistened lips was his customary manner. "Mechanotechnical, you say?" Edith said, prompting the old fisherman along in his tellings. "Aye, I do say." Wilb supped more ale. His rosacea nose glowed crossly as if affronted by the mere inkling that the ale supply might dry up sometime soon. Wilb was a squat old man, a man once accustomed to a life of hard graft at sea, evidenced by ruddy, seasoned cheeks and a scrubby weather-beaten beard. Nowadays, though, he spent his diminishing time propping up the bar, decanting ale after ale into a mouth free and eager to have people hear it spin yarn after yarn. "Sup us up, would you, Edith?" he said, clunking his tankard on the counter. She obliged, and no sooner had Edith placed the overflowing tankard down did he whisk it to eager lips. Wilb supped the foamy cap from his ale, noisily. The obnoxious sound cut through the dull muttering of the tavern. Edith and the catagrous Wilb, who were virtually furniture there, would often have private conversations at a level that was anything but private. It made earwigging effortless for any would-be eavesdroppers, and provided no end of entertainment. Had they actually been furniture, Edith always imagined herself as one of those soft, upholstered armchairs with the pretty floral weavings. Wilb most certainly would have been a gnarled, beer-soaked barrel, precisely like the ones Edith had about the place as tables. As usual, during one of Wilb's accounts, Edith instinctively saw her work-hungry hands were ever occupied. Presently they dried wooden flagons with a grubby cloth dreadfully in need of slinging. And, when the occasion called for it, she topped up Wilb's ghastly flagon as he recounted the day's scandals. Edith had purposefully mislaid that blasted ugly thing once, and only once, much to Wilb's implacable grumpiness. He had carved the monstrosity himself in the likeness of a snarling vuvek bearing flesh-piercing fangs. The horrid receptacle gave her the heebie-jeebies, fiercer than Drakeswood. "What was I saying?" bilched Wilb. "Mechanotechnical thingies," prompted Edith. Filling Wilb with ale was not unlike fueling one of those mechani-technical thingy-bobs, pouring beer in one end rather than shoveling in coal. Hot air came out of both just the same. That was just fine and dandy with Edith, too. The steamier the embellishments, the better. Such raucous tellings ensured the Hog's Trotter remained full of patrons. Not that they had elsewhere to go. When Wilb had worked the sea and spent less time in the tavern, daytimes had been agonisingly quiet. What could she say? The old barnacle had the gift of the gab. True enough, coin rarely passed from Wilb's wind-whittled fingers for most of what he guzzled, but that was no bother to Edith. By and large, ale was the old sea hound's income, and gossip his trade. Yep. Creepy crawling into village, like some wicked insect, that thing. Wilb prattled and gesticulated passionately as he spoke. Legs, it had, surprised you ain't heard already. Everybody's seen it, I say, everybody. He scanned the tavern, eyes smiling at nods from those gaping and gawping in anticipation of his tellings. Of course, Edith hadn't clapped eyes on it. She was forever in the warmth of the tavern, amidst the time-soaked whiff of ale and homely cooking. Nor was it likely that old Mrs. Bramble had seen it either. Bramble's bakery being the only one real competitor to the Hog's Trotter in Ensum village, and Mrs. Bramble being Edith's other source of gossip. Like her, Mrs. Bramble rarely ventured out, what with her ovens and stoves on the go all day and night. The tavern always saw more patrons, though, on account of the ale, Edith imagined. There were knout like ale to lure folk in and make them pliable, to purchasing even more of the stuff. Lucratively addictive was ale. Taking another good slug of his brew, Wilb prepared to divulge the spicier part of his tale. Now he had managed to catch the interest of most folk. He wiped foam from his hedge-like beard and foxtail moustache with his forearm before he continued. Yep. Lots of contraptions that fellow had, I tell you. The oddest convoluted things you've ever seen. But none so queer as what he had strapped to the back of that creepy crawling wagon of his. There was a dramatic, decisive pause as Wilb supped from his snarling flagon yet again. He looked askance from beneath wild scrubby eyebrows. His eyes sparkled in anticipation of his cue. "And what, pray tell, was that?" said Edith, playing her part. She judged by Wilb's enthused intake of breath. She was playing it well. "Ah, now you see. That's just it, ain't it?" he said, leaning low to the tankard in his double-handed grasp as if it was a crystal seeing ball. The entire tavern leaned with him. "No one knows." He straightened up rather snappishly, grinning at the ravenous expectation in everyone's eyes, the wide mouths quivering for more tantalising information. "It were big and round, I'd say." He drew the shape of it in the thick tobacco smoke, hanging in the air with a gnarled finger. "Like a rock or a stone, only it weren't none of them, you know?" No, she didn't know. How could she? Edith was so impatient for more detail she nearly cracked the tankard she was wiping with her strong, meat-cleaving, dough-pounding hands. Wilb eased back on his stool, one arm resting on the counter. He patted down the pockets of his patched-up tunic, producing his tobacco and pipe, and proceeded to stock it. It was a sign for others to speak, to offer their thoughts. Edith peered out from behind the bar, thoughtfully, through the pipe and wood smoke, gazing at nothing in particular. Her hands were now wiping battered metal plates, after determining it a safer activity than wooden flagons. Her mind was on that outlandish fellow of Wilb's story, and the rounded rock that weren't a rock. Everyone in the place had been so disposed, either in their own thinking or nattering, that not one of them had noticed the old oak door crack and groan open, and the wiry figure spider silently in, receding into the shadows. Not until they spoke. "I call it an Orbinall." All eyes lifted off Wilb, and came to rest on the gloomy snug, as though the whole tavern were some single many-eyed creature. Hugely irregular this stranger's voice was, and outlandish to Edith's ears. "And you are most welcome to come and see it," continued the outsider, in an eloquent and unfamiliar manner. For all Edith knew, the gentleman could have come from some far-flung city in the realm, just the other side of Drakeswood, or back in the other direction along the lethal, crumbling cliffs from Tray or Cold, though Edith very much doubted that, as she knew by word of mouth the residents of Cold were fisher-folk, just like the people of Ensum. And this stretched-out fella, no way he were fisher-folk. Not with them snow-white hands what looked as soft as freshly risen dough, and that delicate, sumptuous clothing. "Ain't seen a hard day's work in his life, I bet," thought Edith, as she regarded this fellow inwardly with suspicion, yet outwardly with the warm, good-natured disposition and affability of a landlady who knew her trade. "What will the new gentleman be drinking, then?" Edith asked, all hoppy and poppy. "A herbal tea infusion, if you will." "Don't do tea, I'm afraid," she said, as kindly as she could without seeming rude. "What isn't Seodan is a herbal tea infusion. Ale's what we've got, and all's we've got." "What about old man Clanton's hooch?" came a raspy voice from someone who had probably supped the very stuff once too often. "That rot gut," balked Edith. "You want to kill the new fella, George? You do know what ended old man Clanton, don't you?" "Thought it were one of your pies," chuckled Will with a smirk. Edith glowered and wagged her finger as they shared a laugh. It was then, in the visitor's contemplative silence, Edith noticed the other patrons still staring at the newcomer, slack-jawed, eyes glazed. She coughed and dropped the plate she was holding. It rang on the counter, spinning like a coin, snapping them out of their stupor. Chatting started up, tentative at first, rising at a steady pace until the usual nattering had re-established itself. "Then," said the stranger, after much thought, as he rose from his seat and stepped into the light, "in absence of tea and not wishing to test one's constitution with the local poteen, I will graciously decline and bid a good evening to you all." The slender man snatched the tall hat perched upon his crown and swooped it up in an overzealous bow with all the grace of someone schooled and raised in luxurious ways. City ways. He was clad in an intricately embroidered silken waistcoat, which embraced a severe ribcage in amethyst hues. What seemed leagues of exceptionally black, lavish material clung to slender legs that would not have been misplaced on one of those giant arachnoids that cloistered in the nooks and crannies of the westward cliffs. His impossibly night-black beard dipped like a serpent's tongue, almost licking the flagstones as he bowed. The stranger rose in an unworldly fashion, like a child's push-thumb puppet, to stand proud once more. He returned his hat to its spot and delicately twirled his great curling moustache. Edith couldn't help but feel a tad common and underschooled in such presence. What with her rough manner and plain attire, she was wearing an old pinafore she surely should have swapped for something less fire-scorched by now. Edith was certain she had memories of her apron being white once upon a time, too. She fussed her hair self-consciously. When was the last time she had taken care of it? The hog's trotter always had come first. "Before I take my leave," the slender man's words were saccharine, his mannerisms as smooth as the finest silk, "I must introduce myself, for that, I confess, is the sole objective of my visit." Another hush consumed the tavern. He adjusted a plum-coloured flowery bundle of material around his neck. Edith had not seen the likes of such peculiar neckwear before. City fashion, most like, she thought, with disdain, and coughed impatiently for the stranger to get on with it. Folk were less inclined to drink whilst gawping, and if folk weren't drinking, they weren't spending coin. Edith knew a performance when she saw one too, having spent enough time around Wilb. The name is Zoran, and I have come to bestow upon your village a truly and marvellously extravagant gift. A gift, you says? How about that? Said Wilb, following the comment with a long draught of ale, and an interested squint of his good eye. Zoran smirked, so his slicked moustache curled like the whiskers of a cat fixing on a mouse. To know such things, I entreat you to my store, 5 sun-ups from now. Spread the word. He then raised his voice to an excited pitch, which saw a silence to any straggling conversations. Zoran's enrapturing wares are here for one and for all at an inconceivably sensible price, I might add. A salesman, eh? Croaked George. You'll be hard-pressed to flog anything round here. We don't crave much round these parts, said Wilb, turning to the bar and a topping up, interest waning. Cept ale, muttered Edith, with a hint of protectiveness. Zoran's grin grew into something sinister. Oh, wait until you see what I have to offer. There was something in the way he uttered those words that sat uncomfortably with Edith. Her landlady senses prickled, and that tickle on the tip of her pumpkin nose danced like fairy feet, threatening to tap out a sneeze. The outsider stooped to bow once more, and, with gracious steps that seemed to paint his presence across the slates, exited the tavern to the din of astonished chin-wagging.